I simultaneously had this intuitive knowing, but I already knew the moment he was reported missing that he was gone.
Sally McQuillen, welcome to Passion Harvest. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
A pleasure to be with you, Louisa, and Passion Harvest that bears fruit. It really does. It just makes me think about life purpose.
Oh, okay. Well, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm sure you'll be inspiring uh, many of our viewers that are watching today. I've got a lot of questions to you that I've sent, or things that I'd like to talk about. But I guess first for the audience, I guess this is part of the big journey and part of the show today, the death of your son, Christopher.
Yes, my son Christopher, he passed away in 2016, and that was already 9 years ago, which is so hard to believe. At the age of 21, he and three other boys, um, who were also wild young men, decided to go up to a friend's lake house in Wisconsin during their holiday break from college. And they'd been drinking and decided it would be a good idea to go out on a frozen lake in a canoe, and none of them survived that. So it was a very traumatic, devastating loss. I um, absolutely adored my firstborn, and throughout his life had done everything I could to rein him in, which is really a part of my story and what he taught me and why I wrote Reaching for Beautiful.
A big congratulations on your new book, Reaching for Beautiful. I will leave a link to for people to find you. I mean, I just can't even imagine what it's like to lose a child. What are the aftershocks of grief? I'm just thinking from it's never happened to me, touch wood, but I just don't think I'd believe it at first.
No, there is, it's interesting. I simultaneously had this intuitive knowing, as so he was initially reported missing. And so my husband immediately left the house. I was here with my youngest child, William, who was in high school at the time, and my daughter, Caroline, was in college. And my husband left the house to drive up to Wisconsin to see if they could locate him. But I already knew the moment he was reported missing that he was gone. I just was going through all of these machinations to try to make it not be true. And it is your world. It's interesting. I was describing to some friends of mine who just recently came here for my book launch gathering, my writing group, and we were talking about my home. They were seeing my home, and we're still in the same home that we've been in for 30 years since Christopher was a little baby. And when he was about 4 years old, there was a tree right next to his bed that lightning hit, it struck. And so I was talking about the way the lightning struck this tree and then landed in our attic, caught fire, and then we had all sorts of, fire services and recovery, which meant that we needed to be out of our house for 5 months. But the point that I wanted to come back to was that losing my son felt as if I had been struck through the heart with lightning. People after we had this incident talked about hundreds of yards away discovering pieces of the tree. And that was sort of the way that I experienced this. It was, shattering, absolutely shattering.
Completely broken, is that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Just like free falling. Yeah. Because when it is, and I can speak to other losses I've had, but the thing that I feel like is specific to the loss of a child for a mother is that you've also lost a part of you, and you've lost part of your identity and your job, and then part of the trauma for me lay in what suffering he may have experienced and not necessarily having to had the chance to be there to support him and comfort him in those moments. So that was something that I had to ultimately work through. But um, it is, it's just such an interesting physiological impact, too. I think that any of us, when we're grieving any loss of any loved one, we underestimate how powerful the physiological impact is. Um, so I was in shock, and I knew I was in shock, but at the same time, I had never felt such great pain. So I couldn't believe that shock was operative. And yet,
Physical as well.
yes, very just deeply physical. I felt like I was moving through molasses. I couldn't think straight. I felt like I cognitively impaired a little bit, as if I couldn't really process. So there were all sorts of different, um, I love the word aftershock. And then there's, over time, a series of aftershocks and pains because that's the nature of grief. It ebbs and it flows. Mostly it was flowing in the beginning. There was no reprieve from
Oh
its flow.
gosh. I first of all, I'm very sorry for your grief.
Thank you.
I don't even, I mean, I can't imagine, but losing a child is it something you will ever get over?
You know, it's not. It's not. This experience of missing and yearning and desperation is not as acute as it once was because over time, I have come to believe that Christopher is very much here in spirit. My husband has helped me with that. He had such conviction around that from the very beginning, whereas I struggled to know where has he gone, and I could see that his essence was no longer in his physical body, but I missed and continue to miss his physical body. He was, I'm biased, but he was a gorgeous physical body filled with light. And just because he was so powerful and my love for him is so powerful, it was it's something that has taken a long time to adapt to and to sort of make that transition into appreciating that he is back to being a part of me.
Do you look for signs and symbols or intuitive guidance to feel him or sense him?
I do. I am very much of a feeler. I'm a therapist, and so um, I sort of operate in the field of feelings, and it's where I'm meant to be. I am a sensitive human, and so while I may not necessarily hear my son as my husband's able to, he's able to channel Christopher and sort of hear his voice in his own mind. And from time to time, I'll get little inklings of encouragement from Christopher. I can hear him in that way, but mostly it's a felt sense for me that he is present. And a lot of the reassurance that I have gotten that there is this afterlife has been brought about by talking to mediums and then receiving that kind of validation and having this openness to various signs. And for me, Christopher is a hawk. He is a wild Mustang. He is, there are any number of ways that he makes his presence known, but then I also just simply feel it.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know your thoughts on this, but do you think in some way this was always pre-planned, this his time of death, or for everyone that was affected by his passing?
There were so many people that were gravely impacted by him here on earth. He had this incredibly big, wide open heart. And he also, I think, continues to have a tremendous impact from above. Um, so during his lifetime, he was exceptionally wild and reckless and constantly in motion and all in. And so most of raising him meant that I was on the edge of my seat. And there were emergency room visits. There were at least three near-death accidents at even before we ultimately lost him. And so I have come very much to believe that he was not meant to be here. I remember when, and something about the fact that he is forever 21 suits him. It just suits him. Mediums at some point said something about he sort of sacrificed himself, so that the rest of us could learn something. And I'm not typically somebody who gets angry, but that made me feel angry because I thought, you know, if anyone was going to sacrifice themselves, I would have wanted it to be me. Um, but he might very well have contracted for this,
Mm.
and I might very well have contracted for it too. And it's hard to believe that we would, but
Mm.
the truth is, everybody dies. And so some of us are not meant to be here for a long time. And it's so interesting because my mother, who is 85 now, she said in all of her years, she doesn't believe that she impacted people as much as he did in his 21. And, it's so interesting because I think I had somebody say, oh, his his way of being, his wildness, ultimately cost him his life. And I thought, well, there are plenty of young men who have are under the influence of substances who do silly things, and this happens. And so it could have been, it could have been me when I was young. It could have been just about so many of us who were impulsive and not necessarily thinking of the consequences. But I also, that was Christopher, and I cherish every part of his personality because, I've said this so many times, but I love a handful. So in as much as he challenged me at every moment, there was always something, Louisa. There was literally, it was sort of like we would feel this sense of, okay, I can take a breath, and then, even during he like the rest of us, my husband and I are both in recovery from addiction. And so, not surprisingly, our son inherited his addiction and his attention deficit from his father, all of which made for this, just like we had to send him away to attempt to save his life when he was 16, because we didn't want him to um, lose his life that way. And he had 3 years of sobriety, and he during that time he was in Arizona, and just became his very best self. Ended up mentoring other young men and inspiring them to lead, sober lives. And so he was on this trip hiking with some of these young men and ended up falling down a mine shaft. So here he was perfectly sober and still this happened. And we got a phone call in the middle of the night, and it was that he had fallen. He was down in the bottom of this mine shaft, and it wasn't clear whether or not they were going, I think, well, I can't remember all of the details because of the trauma around it, but essentially later we came to find that had it not happened at a particular time, the helicopter that came in to drop the rescue rope down wouldn't have been able to fly if it had been maybe an hour later, something like this. So he was rescued, and then we were in suspense around whether or not he would be paralyzed. And so we had these kinds of traumas and suspense, and thankfully he survived through that, and we were given a few more years with him. So it's just, you know, I believe in God and that God has some greater plan for us all. And so, when we come back to this idea of passion harvest, like how do we, I had to ask myself in experiencing this and moving through the suffering of it, what I was meant to learn and take away. And I remember one time talking to a medium, or asking him to ask Christopher what my purpose is, so I could find some meaning and reason to stay. And he said something like, Chris was laughing about it. Oh, mom, you already know your purpose. And I feel as if in helping anyone, whether it's my clients or whatever work we do to support organizations to honor Christopher, that help um, young people struggling with addiction, or that um, help young adults who have disabilities and struggle academically. We do this because that's what Chris wants us to do. And having written Reaching for Beautiful, I'm hoping too will help fellow grieving parents find their meaning and reason to live.
It's wonderful. So the search for meaning. Aside from all that, I mean, I just keep thinking, I would as well. Have you ever said, God, why me? I would have never signed up for such suffering.
Yes, part of the grief journey for me, and I'm so grateful that I had the someone suggested early on to be writing about my experience. And so I began journaling to Christopher to promote that connection. And I also could put my feelings on the page. And consequently, draft after draft, that became my memoir. But where it started gave me this opportunity to express each and every part of reconciling every decision that I made during the course of his life, and looking back at my own childhood and making sense of the fear that I brought into being a parent, and then how that was amplified by parenting a wild child, and how I was meant to learn and continue to strive to learn this lesson that so many parents are up against, to relinquish our fear so that we can be more present and loving, and let our children have their struggles. Because even though I may have asked the question, why would this have been my path, or my son's, I have this really um, quiet knowing, which is that's why we're here. We're here to be challenged in various ways so that we can evolve and grow. And so here I've spent all of this time with each of my children trying to prevent, keep them safe and prevent them from having to, with Christopher, a lot of it was like I just didn't want him to feel any sort of shame around being different in any way as I had, or um, just trying to spare him the experience of moving through addiction recovery or whatever it was, or ultimately, of course, try to save his life. And all of that was just a means by which to attempt to control something that wasn't meant to be controlled. And so another part of the question then becomes, why not me? Why not me? And then there's so many of us, whether it's, due to the opioid epidemic, whether it's due to increasing rates of suicide. There are many young people that are um, preceding their parents in death.
Mm. Thank you, Sally. And I guess the big word is control. Of course, we're talking about, the death of children here, and we try and smother them in kindness, but it's also individually controlling our lives and expecting certain outcomes, and that also causes suffering.
Yes, this idea of outcome is so interesting to me because I somehow, and I think maybe many of us do, believed that if I did everything right in sort of a certain way, whatever right meant, that that would grant me a certain outcome. And so when it's revealed that there isn't, and by no means then is the message, I kind of went through all sorts of analytical thinking, which, things like, oh, wait a minute, I had worked to let go of fear, and then he died. So should I have been in fear? Those kinds of questions. Or I, you know, I should I not have done certain things that I thought were the right things? And you can get yourself tied up in knots around this. And ultimately, somehow, and I'm not sure how this shone through, but if I've heard anything from my son, it's this idea that love is the only thing that matters. The, so our loving relationship that was made possible by letting go of some of the fear, because Christopher was insanely independent. And so the more I would chase or attempt to, make sure that he was safe, so to speak, the more he'd be off and running. And when after he'd had that period of sobriety, he decided to go to college and drink again because he wanted to be like his peers, that's when some of my most challenging work of letting go of fear began. And when I thought about that which I could control, which was only to love him, it facilitated more presence and connection than did me being driven by an energy that pushed him away.
Yes, I mean, you talk about as well, the just the power of love and the importance of love. I guess that's what it's all about, isn't it?
It really is. I was having a conversation with a friend recently living in our community. And maybe in most communities, there's increasing emphasis on achievement and on different definitions of success than I ultimately have come to, which is, I'm not even sure Christopher, because of his ADD and some of his learning issues, would have been able to complete college, certainly as long as he was drinking and using drugs. That made it very difficult, when he was um, he was quite bright in his and could write beautifully. And so, but some of his gifts were better tapped into when he was his best self when he wasn't navigating addiction. And so I don't know that he would have achieved, that college education in its entirety. But what he achieved for me as his mother makes me immensely proud. There are so many people whom he have, you know, come to us and shared with us stories where his compassion made all the difference for them. One of his peers in college um, is a gay woman who was just coming out, and she felt like she could come out to Christopher. And he was apparently so unconditionally accepting. He said, "Oh, I know, I already knew that, and um, and please, may you feel free to be exactly who you are in the world." And she's since done more of that, and those are the kinds of things that, to me, are it just is indicative of the power of love, and why we're really here is to spread that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. What's your advice for those that are watching or listening that are experiencing or going through grief?
So this is where I put my therapist hat on a little bit. There were a number of things that I knew as a therapist that I really needed to begin to practice what I preach. And there is nothing like losing a child to grant oneself, or losing anyone for that matter, to grant oneself that permission slip to take care of ourselves at a whole nother level. And, starting with some of those basics, because grief does have such a physiological impact. So, and look, I didn't take my own advice here necessarily. I was, seeking comfort in, after I could, there was a period of time where I couldn't eat at all. But then when I began to be able to eat, or there was a period of time I wasn't sleeping well, but when began to be able to eat, then I was reaching for sweets to feel, comforted. Finding the means by which we feel comfort, ensuring that we are fueling ourselves, getting proper rest. But um, beyond that, recognizing that because especially when you've lost a child, that is inherently traumatic. So you're going to be in fight or flight, and your nervous system, you're going to be like the cortisol is firing, and the blood pressure and all of those things are on fire. And so recognizing that, being gentle with oneself, and for me, one of the things that I encountered was sort of a social anxiety. because my community was fully aware of what had taken place. And so, not knowing what I was going to encounter, whether it was people who were um, filled with emotion on my behalf, and then being in a position for the first time ever not to take care of them, I just didn't have the bandwidth. Really appreciating that bandwidth is deeply compromised. Um, and then the final thing I would say is self-compassion. So many of us, um, and I'm sort of renowned for this, it's like push through and think that we need to show up in our grief a particular way, and you sort of like a traditionally strong way. And grief is so messy that that's not possible. We have to kind of surrender to it and then give ourselves so much self-compassion because it takes time. I've said for me, it took over 7 years before I started to feel entirely like myself again. That's a long time. And sometimes, just sort of appreciating that that, as we said earlier, I will always be grieving my son. Um, and but it lightens over time. And then sometimes you get hit. There are aftershocks even now, just unanticipated and anticipated.
Thank you, Sally. What what is you talk about this, but what are some of the things to say and not to say when one is experiencing grief or loss or trauma? I mean, what, sometimes people are uncomfortable and don't know what to say, or perhaps say the wrong things.
Of course they do. And I was one of them. I remember a friend or an acquaintance having lost her daughter and thinking, oh, I saw her at a coffee shop. I'm not going to approach her. I'm just amazed that she's standing up, and thinking, and I've heard some people say, and I always get a chuckle out of this, oh, I just don't want to remind you of of your loss. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, it's a part of my cells, it's a part of my very being, it's with me constantly. So um, we feel like we have to say the right thing, and there is no right thing to say. There's this wonderful animation that Brene Brown did about 9 years ago that illustrates beautifully the difference between sympathy and empathy. So, not only do we, at least I'll speak for myself, I really felt further alienated um, as a bereaved mom who was a walking illustration of everybody's greatest fear when people would turn away. If people would and could be willing just to dip into for a moment, bearing witness to my pain, it was a huge gift. So to approach rather than walk away, and to develop the skill of some empathy, which is not so much this, I can't imagine, um, I'm going to stay here in a state of pitying you. The illustration that Brene Brown, with this animated little short, there's somebody who's hurting and he's all the way down in the bottom of a well, and then somebody else is up at the top going, hey, do you need a sandwich? And so rather than sort of that experience, what is so moving to me is anytime somebody's willing to climb the ladder down and just be with me and recognize there's no fixing this. This is here. And it's just being present for as long as you can stand. And understandably, you wouldn't be able to stand it for very long, you know? There's for me that complete appreciation of the fact that it hasn't been easy for my family and friends to, but if you can continue to check in over time, because we're consumed with this loss for a long time.
Well, a big congratulations again on your book, Reaching for Beautiful, Sally. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the Passion Harvest audience that I haven't asked you today?
I just love this idea of letting grief have its way with us enough to be able to look to the light, enough to be able to really deeply feel the presence of the loved ones we've lost. When we are in suffering, it's harder for them to get through to us, I feel like. And I know that they don't want us to. I know that Chris wants me to carry out my purpose in this life and keep my heart open.
Thank you so much. And where's the best place for people to connect with you?
They can reach me and order my book if they'd like at www.sallymcquillen, McQuillen.com.
And again, I'll leave a link below in the show notes. Sally, thank you so much for being on Passion Harvest.
My pleasure. So glad I could be with you.
Oh, what a profound journey you've had in this life.
Truly, some of us do, don't we?
Yes, but you're doing wonderful work. So thank you very much.
Appreciate you, Louisa.
Okay,
Thanks
bye,
again.
Sally.
Bye.
Bye.